How often has this happened to you? So you're playing a game of Catan, you put out your starting settlements, you got a 6-2-10 and a 6-5-10, 5 resources, and 21 production. You're feeling really good about yourself. Well, your opponent goes, he puts out twin 3-4-8 settlements, 5 resources and 20 production, and he's feeling really good about himself too. So the game starts, the dice start rolling, and before long you're thinking this is fine, and then bam, you lose. And it's not even close, it's a massacre. It's like 10-4 or something stupid. You feel sick to your stomach, really terrible, and you think, what the heck's going on here? You look at the dice rolls and you see, oh my goodness, his 3s, 4s, and 8s have rolled 31 times compared to your 14 rolls. Ugh, what the actual F? Then you start asking questions, like how often does this happen? Can I do anything about it? Or do I just suck at this game? If you find yourself asking these questions, then you might just be suffering from bad luck. In this video, we're going to explore how luck affects your starting setups. There are many aspects of luck in Catan, starting with the board itself. Luck determines the placement of the resource hexes, the number tiles, and the ports. There's also the quality of the opponents that you might play in a game. There's the order in which you settle the board. There's the dice rolls themselves, and of course, the development cards that you buy. Because there are so many aspects of luck in Catan, we can't possibly quantify them all. So for the scope of this video, we're going to narrow it down to one facet in particular. That is our starting 2 settlement placements, the number tiles associated with those settlement placements, and all of the dice rolls that occur throughout a game of Catan. We chose this criteria because all 3 aspects are available 100% of the time throughout the entire game of Catan. The only time one of them won't be available is when a robber has blocked a resource. However, we're not including that in the scope of this video because we don't have the time and it's very hard to quantify. To quantify luck, I've created a new metric called luck percentage that I'm going to use throughout the video. First, I'm going to define a few things, and then I'm going to show you how our luck percentage is calculated. I need to define a few terms I'll be using to calculate luck percentage. First, there's actual resource yield, which is the actual number of times you receive resources from dice rolls. Then there's expected resource yield, which is the expected number of times you should receive resources from dice rolls. Finally, there's expected non-7 resource yield, which is the expected number of times you should receive resource rolls from non-7 rolls. Let's have a look at an example actual versus expected resource yield and how to calculate it. These are our 2 starting settlements. We have an 8-4-10 and a 2-5-10. In this scenario, we're going to look at 45 different rolls, and this is the distribution of our numbers. So we have our 2, our 4, our 5, our 8, and our 10 twice. The actual amount of times the dice rolled was 29. So we can look here at the expected amount of times those dice would roll through 45 rolls, and we'll actually see that it's 23.75. So in this case, our actual resource yield outperformed our expected resource yield by 22%. Let's have a look at expected non-7 resource yield. When 7s roll, you don't receive any resources. So the only time you could receive a resource is when a 7 doesn't roll. In our 45 roll scenario, our actual resource yield was 29, which means I rolled for a resource 64% of the time. However, by removing the 7s, only 39 resource producing rolls occurred, which ups our resource roll percentage up to 74%. This is a big difference from a 2 out of 3 chance to a 3 out of 4 chance. We then take our actual resource yield and divide it by our new expected non-7 resource yield, and we get our second metric of 117%. To calculate luck percentage, you take the actual resource yield divided by the expected resource yield, and the actual resource yield divided by the expected non-7 resource yield, and average the 2 outcomes for your luck percentage. Let's take the numbers from our examples. If we combine these 2 metrics, we get a calculated luck percentage of 119.76%, which means our 45 roll game was indeed a lucky one. I've created a luckiness scale so we can bucket our luck percentage into groups. Average luck would be equal to 100%. with anything under 100% being unlucky and anything over 100% being lucky. I've grouped the scale into buckets of 10% and defined each bucket with a name corresponding to its perceived luckiness. As an example, if your luck percentage was 72%, you had a very unlucky game. Whereas if you had a 119% luckiness, like in our example game, you had a lucky game. Let's take a look at the data. I'll be reviewing how luck affected our 500 completed games of Catan using our luck percentage scale. As a reminder, luck percentage only includes our starting 2 settlement locations. The question I'm asking is, what impact did my starting settlement's luckiness have on the outcome of the game? This graph shows our 500 games grouped by our luckiness buckets. You'll see that slightly unlucky, normal luck, and slightly lucky made up about 74% of our total games, whereas lucky and unlucky made up 20% of our games, and our most unlucky and lucky games at the extremes made up about 6% of our games. This graph is showing the average luckiness per bucket. The worst luck is only getting about 69% of their expected resource rolls, while the most lucky is getting about 132% of their average resource rolls. Right in the middle with 99.9% luck is the normal luck. For all 500 Catan games, we actually skewed slightly lucky, averaging 100.46% luck. If you're enjoying this video, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. This graph is showing the actual versus expected resource yields by luckiness. So right in the middle, at normal luck, we're basically at parity, where we're receiving about as many resources as we would expect to receive. But the more extreme you get from the center, you'll see that there's quite a large difference between the resources we receive and the resources that we expect. This graph visualizes the difference between actual versus expected yield. So you'll see at normal luck, again, we're receiving about as much as we would expect. Whereas with very unlucky, we're actually receiving 10.5 fewer resources than we would expect to receive in a game. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we're getting 9.5 more resources in those very lucky games than we would expect to receive. This graph shows the average settled resource dice rolls by luckiness. Now I have this shown in 2 different ways. I have the average resource roll percentage in dark blue and the average resource roll percentage without 7s in light blue. So what does this actually mean? Well, with normal luck, you would expect the dice to roll one of your numbers 56% of the time. And without a 7, say there wasn't a 7 in your dice, you would expect your resource to hit 2 out of 3 rolls. Now, on the very unlucky side, this goes down to like 39% and 46%, which is pretty bad, getting, a resource maybe a little bit more than 1 out of 3 rolls. Not great. But on the more extreme side, on the very luckiness, think about this. Your rolls are hitting 3 out of 4 times. Right? That's how often you're collecting resources. And if you take 7s out of it, man, you're scoring 86% of the time when a 7 doesn't roll, which is crazy. That's really lucky. This graph shows you that luckiness is pretty independent of the number of starting resource hexes you have and your average total production. I was thinking that maybe settling on 5 hexes all the time with 18 production, that those games would actually be more unlucky than games where we settled 6 hexes with 22 production. But this graph shows that's actually not the case, because our distribution of hexes and total production is pretty consistent no matter how lucky we were. This graph looks at the average number of dice rolls and 7 roll percentage per game grouped by luckiness. In terms of dice rolls, luckier games tend to have fewer rolls than unlucky games. For 7s, luckier games rolled fewer 7s than unlucky games. Very unlucky games proved to be the outlier in both cases, because they had both a lower number of rolls and fewer 7s than average. This graph shows the average number of times we were robbed and our average final score grouped by luckiness. I was actually surprised here, as I expected our most unlucky games to have the most robs. However, that was not actually the case, as they wound up having the fewest robs. In fact, the second fewest number of robs occurred in our luckiest games. Now, this makes sense because in both cases, our games are generally shorter because we're either doing very well or we're doing very, very badly. For final score, our average score increases from very unlucky to very lucky. However, the gap between very unlucky and unlucky is a pretty shocking 1.9 points and is the highest difference between two neighboring groups. Of all the graphs, I think this is the most interesting. It shows the win percentage by luckiness. So right in the middle, at 44.67%, that is our normal luck, which coincidentally also happens to be our win percentage for 500 games, right around 44 and change percent. So that's pretty normal for me, maybe not normal for you. However, if you look at the more extremes here, on the very unlucky side, we played 15 games and we did not win a single one. Where on the opposite end of the spectrum, we played 17 very lucky games and won every single one except one, so a 94% win rate. And I expect this is probably pretty true for players of all experience levels. Their most unlucky games, maybe you win 1 out of 50, 1 out of 100, and your most lucky games, you probably lose 1 out of 50 or 1 out of 100. Really depends. But I'll say this, I think it's more likely that you're going to lose a lucky game than win an unlucky game. Here is the game with the most extreme luck percentage that I have ever played. This is me with the red settlements. I picked 4th here. I actually posted this image in the community a little while ago, and it was agreed that blue and green have the best setups here. But let's see what ultimately happened after the game ended with 44 dice rolls. This graph shows our actual versus expected dice rolls for this game. In total, the dice were rolled 44 times. Now you're going to notice that the 6 rolled 12 times and the 8 rolled once. Well, if you remember from the previous slide, this guy had 2 settlement locations on the 6. So you can imagine what that did for our luck percentage. In fact, let's have a look. Let's look at the numbers of our most extreme game. The game is called When Literally Every Roll Goes Our Way. And I was not aware of how extreme it was when I named it. I'll post a link to it in the description. Let's start with player 1. They actually had a very lucky setup, and if it was any other game, this player probably wins, as they yielded 7.5 more resources than expected. If I had played this position, it would have ranked as my 11th luckiest setup. Let's contrast this with player 2, who had an insanely unlucky setup. They managed to acquire only 14 resources via dice rolls the entire game, because they never expanded out of their original 2 settlement locations. In fact, this is actually the unluckiest setup I have ever recorded. For comparison, my unluckiest setup had a 60% luck percentage, so this player was extreme in their unluckiness. Player 3 was right on the border of a very unlucky setup with 76.5 luck percent. This seems downright opulent compared with Green's 51%, but still quite unlucky overall. Finally, let's look at my setup. Now this was absolutely nuts. I yielded 15 more resources than expected for an insanely lucky 157 luck percentage. This was by far my luckiest recorded setup. For comparison's sake, my second luckiest setup had a 138.2 luck percentage. In fact, the difference between my setup and Green's is over 105%, which makes it by far the largest of any game I've played. Let's look at some conclusions based on our data. So, out of 500 games, there was a 74% chance of normal or slightly lucky or slightly unlucky setups occurring. There was a 20% chance of lucky or unlucky setups, and a 6% chance of very unlucky or very lucky setups occurring. We also determined that the starting number of resource hexes and your starting production don't really influence how lucky you are. However, what does help influence your luckiness is your skill level. The more skilled you are, the less you should be affected by luckiness. And the less skilled you are, the more luckiness will factor into whether you can win. As an example of how skill level can help you overcome luckiness, take a look at how I fared with my 44% win percentage through 500 games, categorized by luckiness. Now contrast my win percentage with someone with a theoretical 33.33% win percentage. Finally, here is how somebody with a 50% overall win percentage might fare against luckiness. While it's not impossible to win even the luckiest game of Catan, sometimes you'll need other luck factors such as dev cards, trades, or poor opponents to pull off an unlikely victory. I hope you enjoyed this analysis of how luck affects your starting resource settlements. I'm Catan, and I'll see you online.